Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about denial of service attack with the vulnerabilities in Solidity. So in this vulnerable contract here, we can see that it has a storage value for a leader and the highest bid of the contract. And the idea here is that you can call the bid function and it will, if you've passed in more ETH than the previous bid, you will become the leader of the contract and it will return the previous leader's ETH to them. And so where this becomes a vulnerability is we are requiring that this leaders.send the highest bid. So we're trying to send the ETH to the leader. We're requiring that that is successful. And an attacker contract could come along and say, hey, you know what? Anytime my contract is called, I'm no longer going to take ETH. I'm going to revert that transaction. And by always reverting that transaction, we can no longer set a new leader and a highest bid. So it causes this function to become invalid or no longer usable. And that's where the denial of service comes along. And so we just have a little helper function here to check the leader as well. And so an attacker contract is pretty straightforward. It's just going to have a reference to the vulnerable contract. It's going to have a fallback function. So anytime ETH gets passed to this attacker contract, it's just going to revert that transaction. And then we just have the ability to place a bid saying, hey, if you pass in more ETH than the previous highest bid, we will call the vulnerable contracts bid function. So let's see what that might take. Let's see what that might look like. Come in here and deploy the vulnerable contract. We will get the address of that vulnerable contract and deploy the attacker contract. And just to kind of get us started, I'll switch it over to ETH. And let's say we pass in 2 ETH to this vulnerable contract. We can see that the highest bid is now 2 ETH and that I am the current leader, AB8. That is my current account. So now what I'll do is I will come down here and I'll switch accounts to the 4B2 and I will pass in 3 ETH to the attacker contract, place that bid. We can see that the attack was successful over here in the transactions. If I were to go to the vulnerable contract now and look at the current leader, it's going to be the address of the attacker contract, so the 652, and the highest bid is now 3. So if I were to just go back to the, let's change accounts one more time, 5B3, and try to place a bid of, let's say, 10 ETH, place that bid, it's going to get reverted because the attacker contract doesn't accept ETH. So you can see that the leader is still the 652 and the highest bid is still 3. So what does it look like to correct or prevent your contracts from being denial of service? We will implement something called the pull payment system. And what that means is we're going to make it so that people have to come in and pull their ETH out as opposed to sending them the ETH every time their transactions get, or every time a leader gets updated. So a secure contract might look like this. It's going to have that leader, it's going to have the highest bid, and it's also going to have who needs refunds. And so now in the bid function, what we're going to do is we are going to give the leaders their new bid anytime they get overridden, and then set the new leader to the new sender and its highest bid to the new value. And then here's that helper function to just check the leader again. But the new part here is now we're requiring the previous leaders to come and withdraw their funds as opposed to us sending it to them. So we're saying, hey, if you have any refunds, we will send those off to you. And so what this does is if an attacker contract were to come in here and say, hey, I'm no longer going to take ETH, they're really just causing themselves issues now. So the attacker contract is going to look exactly the same. It's not going to be able to accept ETH, and it will it'll still make a bid on that contract. So I will compile that real quick. All right, and so now what we'll do is we'll deploy the secure contract. We will grab its address here quick and deploy the attacker contract. So now if I come along and say I will just give it 1 ETH, we'll bid on this contract here, get the leader, we can see that the 5B3 is the current leader with the highest bid being 1. If If I were to say switch to a new account here and send this attacker contract to ETH, we can now see that the highest bid is 2 ETH. The leader is going to be that attacker contract, but we can see that my previous account is still missing some ETH. So what I'll have to do is go back to that 5B3 and withdraw my funds. And we can see that I was able to get back my funds. And if I were to switch to the attacker well, let's go back to a new contract here and pass it in 3 ETH. So we can see that now I have 3 ETH and I am the new leader here, the 4B2. And if I were to go into the attacker contract, and if I wanted to withdraw my funds, it's going to get reverted because the attacker contract doesn't accept ETH. So we can kind of see how the attacker contract now is just kind of preventing itself from getting ETH and no one else. One thing that I do want to note is when you're doing this withdraw refunds, to not do any sort of looping in here over all the available refunds. You may want to say, hey, you know what, I'm just going to create one function to refund all of them. The problem with that is in the same scenario where if one of those transactions fails, the whole loop gets reverted. So now no one's ETH will get sent to them. So just be aware of that. Just make the withdraw functions to allow individual users to come back and get that or individual contracts. That's everything. Thanks.